Welcome to this online Bible study on Galatians chapter 3, verses 6 through 9. And in these verses, we're going to ask and look at one question. How can we be a true child of God? And we're going to discover that truth as we go through this text. So let's go ahead and dive in. So in verse 6 through 9 here, Paul's again in chapter 3. In chapter 3, Paul is dealing with doctrine. And in dealing with doctrine, Paul wants to use the example. He's going to use the example of the Old Testament teaching. In other words, hence he's going to go back to Abraham here in these verses and throughout the rest of this first section of chapter 3. So let's go ahead and dive in and look at the context of chapter 3, verse 6. So the context of this teaching is going to be, there's two groups of thought. There are Paul's opposers. All throughout the book of Galatians, he's dealing with the people that oppose his view. And the opposers, they use the law as their basis of understanding. And, they point everything back to the law of Moses. And Paul is going to actually go and use an example from the Old Testament that goes back even farther into the Old Testament history. He's going to go back earlier. He's going to go to Father Abraham. Abraham is in the book of Genesis. Moses and the law didn't come. God doesn't deliver the law on Mount Sinai until Exodus, several hundred years later. So Paul's going to go back even earlier in Old Testament and Jewish history, and he's going to go back to Abraham here in these verses. So let's look at verse 6 and see what he has to say. So essentially we're going to see two promises here in these verses, but let's start with verse 6. So also Abraham believed God. Now notice the quotation marks. Quotation marks, believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So believed God, and what was the outcome? Credited as what? Righteousness. Now where in the world is Paul referring to? Where is this quotation taken from? Well, this promise number one that we're going to look at, comes from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. And this promise number one is to Abraham. Now let's jump back in history a little bit here without going too far and look at what the promise was here. So Abraham believed something about God. So what was the situation? Abraham, number one, was childless. He was an older guy and his wife was older. So first of all, they were childless in old age. And then God comes along in Genesis here and he says that there will be descendants. You're going to have descendants that will be as numerous to count as the grains of sand on the seashore. So God comes to an old guy who is childless in his old age, and his wife, and they have no children, and he promises them, you're going to have so many descendants you won't even be able to count them all. And what was Abraham's response? His response is what you have here in verse 6. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So the situation in that Old Testament passage is he believed. He believed, and as a result, what happened? Faith and belief equaled what? Led to right standing before God. So in this first promise here, let's go ahead and make that a number one. So promise number one here that we look at in this text, promise number one is referring to what happened in the Abraham story in Genesis 15. He was childless, God promised him descendants, and he believed, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That's what we see in verse 6. But we're not done here. This text has so much more to teach us here. And in verse 7 it goes on. Understand then that those who have faith are who? They're children of Abraham. In other words, they're children of the promise. They are people who follow in that lineage and who are fulfilling that promise. They are the right people before God. Those who have faith. We'll come back to that. In verse 8, Scripture, again referring to the Old Testament teachings, foresaw that God would justify, again, not guilty, completely free, the Gentiles. Now again, Paul is talking about the Gentiles here. That's the question. That's the circumstance around this teaching. The Gentiles. How are the Gentiles? What's their faith like? These Gentiles, by faith, become like Abraham and denounce the gospel in advance to Abraham. In other words, all the way back before the law was even given to Moses, there was another promise in Genesis. So let's talk about promise number two. Promise number two is this quote. All nations, all people, all tribes, all nations will be blessed through you. In other words, somehow fulfilling what God taught Abraham. So this promise number 2, let's talk about it in more detail and see what it means. First of all, it's a quote from Genesis 12:3. This is the place where God says, promises Abraham that, again, his descendants will be as numerous as a seashore and that all people will be blessed through him in some form or fashion. So these two promises are directly related. There's a promise of descendants. Without any descendants, how in the world can all people be blessed through Abraham? So, but yet that's the promise. The promise is that all nations will be blessed. All nations will be blessed. Now again, notice 12. This came first. All nations will be blessed through Abraham. So naturally, you understand the crisis and the situation here, as Abraham's an old guy and his wife is older and they're childless. And then God says your descendants will be as numerous as a seashore. So again, this belief and faith here is all important. So, all nations will be blessed. Again, going back to the Gentiles here. So this promise to Abraham that all nations will be blessed. So how is that going to happen? And what's the importance of that? So the Gentiles in this passage, the teaching here is that the Gentiles will be a part of this promise. How? By faith. By faith, the Gentiles will be a part of the promise to Abraham just the same as the Jewish people. And the Jewish and Gentile all alike will be a part of the promise of Abraham and part of fulfilling God's plan for all of humanity by faith. So let's go back up to the question. The original question was, how can we be a true child of God? And the simple answer to this is by faith. By faith, we are a part of the promise and we are a true child of God. By faith, one, as individuals. Abraham had to believe, number one, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So individuals must have faith. We have to have faith ourselves. We have to make a personal choice to believe the promise. And number two, universally. This promise of faith and being a part of the promise is universally available to all. Jew and Gentile alike, the Egyptian, the Asian, the Russian, the African American, the American, it doesn't matter what your race, doesn't matter your nationality. This promise that you can be a true child of God by faith is an individual choice you must make, and it's universally available to all.